Welcome, 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 and good afternoon. I am Alex Eminette. I am the Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Uber, and I go by the pronouns he and him. I want to welcome everybody. I know this is a session after lunch, so we're all a little bit full, and this is for my 40-plus crowd. This conference hits a little bit differently on day 3, especially after a night out at Animal Kingdom. So I appreciate all the walking and trekking and getting us here today. I feel honored to be up here today and to moderate a panel with some of Uber's best and brightest international future trans and non-binary leaders. Before we get started, though, I wanted to call out an elephant in the room. I was not originally supposed to be up here speaking with you today. I was not involved in the ideation. I was not involved in the design of this workshop or the hard work or the investment put into this really critical and worthy conversation. And I'm sharing that for 3 reasons. One, I am the only cisgendered male that you're going to see up here today on the panel. We did have a panelist from APAC, our employee and comms specialist from India, Ayan Agrawal. Unfortunately, I know they are watching virtually. They had some issues with their visa and being able to be here today with us. So I am here to help and make sure that we can flex, we can pivot, and we can still have a great conversation. We did have some audio and visual recordings of Ayan so that he could also still be represented. Those are also not being able to be played with our system here, so I apologize in advance. As part of our flex, though, at the end of the panel, we are going to make sure that our APAC regional leader, Brian De Jesus, is here with us in the audience. He has a lot of experience, not just in APAC, but a very personal and close relationship with Ayan, and will be able to fill in some of those nuances to ensure that's included in this conversation today. The second reason I bring that up is I really want to make sure that the credit, that the overall applause, kudos for this wonderful conversation is given to the brilliant panelist that I'm going to introduce in a moment up here on stage. Some of you may remember that last year, Uber came back to Out and Equal after being non-present over the last few years. You may also remember that we had a very candid conversation around owning our past, owning where we currently are, and committed and focused on where we are moving into the future. Particularly, we lost trust with some of our LGBTQIA+ community a couple of years ago when there was an LA Times article that highlighted trans earners and some of the difficulties they had in navigating our technology and some of the discrimination that came around with it. This is a continuation of that conversation and our journey to evolve and to progress. You're going to hear some updates around some of that in the conversation today. We have come to Out and Equal with a lot of intentionality, both last year and this year. Part of the conversation today is for us to really lean in on what it means to develop our trans and non-binary leaders. It also means to continue to be at the forefront as a thought leader and own the responsibility of what global safety looks like for our community as we travel, as we enter into different countries and regions within this world. And finally, we are here because we really want to position the complexity and the nuances of what it means to be a global organization. Most of us like to use that term that we work at large global organizations. But the reality is we are US-based organizations that started and founded in the United States, and we grew internationally. And because of that, as we grew, we didn't always recognize that we were still operating, developing talent, creating cultures that were very US-based and centric. And we missed out on some of the nuances of the conversation of what it means to be an underrepresented community from an international perspective. So that's really our main goal and intentionality today is what does it mean to be trans, non-binary, and other countries around the world that is not just from a US-based platform. So with that said, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to introduce my brilliant panelists and bring them up on stage. If I can get this going. All right. First and foremost, he is now a celebrity. You've probably seen him on some other panels at Out and Equal this year. Bernardo Besa. Bernardo uses the pronouns he, him. He is from Brazil. He is on our litigation council there. And for those of you who did not know, Bernardo was also named one of the top 40 under 40 lawyers in global corporate organizations. Bernardo also is one of our regional leaders who sits in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Next up is Catherine Palmer. Catherine uses the pronouns she, her. She sits in our South Africa office, and she is one of our strategic and data analysts for our global sustainability at Uber. She is part of our Pride at EMEA group. And finally, but not least, we have Indigo Avisov. Indy is on my team. They are one of our senior DI business partners for overall Uber. They go by the pronouns they and them. So one more round of applause for our panelists. All right. I think one of the most important things that we have seen at Out and Equal this year is we know the power of telling our own stories. So I want to start there. And Catherine, I'm going to start with you, and I would love to hear kind of about your journey, your transition, and your findings along the way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I grew up in South Africa, lived there all my life, initially in a very small town, a very conservative environment in the 90s, and I went to a very traditional all-boys Catholic school. So for a long time, I had no exposure to the concept of being trans. People often say, when did you know you were a girl? I couldn't have known that as a child because it wasn't an option available to me. I knew that I wished that I was, but I couldn't own it growing up the way that it's wonderful to see people do today. So when I first got exposed to anything in the LGBTQIA+ community, it was being called gay. People assumed that I was gay because of the feminine way that I acted. And that was very much a negative thing in that community. But that was the only way I had to make sense of being feminine, was that the explanation must be that I'm gay. So when I moved to a big city at the start, well, during high school, I thought, this is going to be so much better now. Here I can be openly gay, and I came out and found community. And over the next few years of finishing high school and college, I kind of got to meet finally more and more people from the broader LGBTQ+ community, and started to really introspect and think a lot about where I actually fitted into that. And I thought about it in a very academic way. That was my way of processing the world. I kind of intellectualized, like, well, there's this component of my experience, there's that component of my experience, but do they really add up to make me a woman? What is a woman? And yeah, I thought about that for a long time, and what really helped in the end was finding a very specific community, and people who helped me realize that none of that really mattered. That I simply was, and that was okay. And yeah, I was fortunate to find that community when I was in my early 20s, and then begin my transition in the workplace. It was pre-Uber days. There were highlights and lowlights that we'll get into just now of how that went in the workplace. But yeah, I'm very happily me now, 10 years later, married, living very happily as myself at Uber. And
Catherine, I wanted to follow up with a question. When you went through, you made a really critical point here of really not even having the fluency or the definition as a child around what trans meant. As you started to meet colleagues and peers that were trans from other countries around the world, what were the comparisons or the differences as you were introduced to the trans community in South Africa versus maybe some of your peers in the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there was a very different level of understanding in community in general of what all these different identities within the broad rainbow umbrella mean. And for example, in South Africa, as I sort of alluded to, the identity of gay is not just an identity of sexual orientation. It is, for many people, a gender identity. It is, for many people, a place and an identity in which they get to explore gender and use different pronouns, use different names without ever using the word transgender. And I think finding that that difference when talking to people from different parts of the world allowed me to get a very broad platter of options of identities and pick and choose the ones that worked for me. And for that to also evolve over time as I met other people and resonated with parts of their stories.
Thank you, thank you. Bernardo, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you have shared a very heartfelt story on some other panels as you've kind of spoken through the week. But for those who were not able to be present, would love to hear your story, your journey in coming out as trans.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Um, as Alex already mentioned, my name is Bernardo. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm from Brazil. I was born and I grew in a city called Manaus. It's in the Amazon state and also Brazil, surrounded by the Amazon rainforest. I didn't, same as Catherine already mentioned, I didn't have knowledge or words to express exactly what I felt. And my family, it's a very traditional family. My parents work in the public sector. They are all Catholic. We had, I didn't have opportunity back that time to get in touch with people that could bring me some type of information and experiences that I needed to understand myself. When I was about 13 or 14 years old, I started to question my sexual orientation. And I think for when we are talking with other transgender people, most of them feel the same way because we don't have this knowledge about what is being a transgender people. So the first thing that I was questioning and trying to understand what was why I have an attraction for women. I'm supposed to have attraction for women, but oh my God, I also have attraction for boys. It's so confusing, and I don't have, even in my school, someone that I could chat about that. And I'm so close to my parents. I really like them. They are so caring and loving with me. So I felt that I had to, I didn't know what to expect from them if I started this conversation. But I thought that I had to do this. And when I was 14 years old, I just said that, oh, I have to say something to you. I think that maybe, I, not sure, but I think that maybe I like boys and girls, and their reaction was really bad. Really, really, really bad. I had to pass through different times with my family after that. And we started to not talk about things. So I started to live like a parallel life, the life that they knew and the life that I had to, that I could be part of me, but in a private way, very, very private way. As I already said, I didn't have a friend to talk about it because I didn't knew a gay or a lesbian or a bisexual colleague or person. So people in my school started to realize that I was dating girls, and they started to talk about it. So I became the lesbian girl of my school. Like it was the title. And I didn't understand that because I didn't feel I was lesbian, but I couldn't explain why I didn't feel that way. Because, as Catherine mentioned, I didn't have words to say that. I didn't have knowledge to explain to myself what I was feeling. So I grew up with this separate life. I started to know people, meet people outside my school that were older than me, that were from the community, but none of them were transgender people. I decided to learn law, to study law at the university, and in my place in the north of Brazil, it's a traditional work field. People don't talk about practice law working in a company, only the private sector or in formal law firms and traditional law firms. So everything was so messed up for me back that time. And then I had the opportunity to go to São Paulo and and study for a month and a half digital law. That was a new thing back that time. We didn't have schools and people teaching there in my city. So that's when everything changed. And in São Paulo, it's a bigger city. And I started to know places that I could get some information, to meet different people, to have access to all the data that I couldn't back that time. And that's when I joined Uber. And everything really started to change, because when I joined the company, there were already transgender employees in Brazil, and they were already, the company already has the ERG prior to Uber. I started to volunteer to work with the task force and the projects, and they were already working with transgender inclusion. And my mind just blew, because I was, oh my God, I don't know what I'm feeling, but something's shaking inside of me. I have to chat with these people. I have to get to know them. I have to understand why I'm feeling that way. And after some months of therapy and everything, I figured out that and accepted that I am a transgender person. And yes, that really changed my life after that.
Indy, I know that you have been at the forefront of this topic for a while now. You've been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion now for 7, 8 years at this point. And this is something that you're not only comfortable talking with, but that you have led communities in these conversations. So we'd love to hear about your journey, your perspective, and how you have grown with your own voice on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And it's always so beautiful to hear the personal stories of my colleagues. Even though I know the two of you really well, like getting to hear you again is always like such a gift. So thanks for sharing what you had to say. For me, so I grew up in the U.S. I'm a California baby, born and raised. I see some hands over here. And I recently moved to Washington, D.C. But growing up as a kid, I grew up in a really religious environment. So I come from Slavic background. My grandmother was born in Ukraine. My grandfather was born in Russia. They were prisoners of war in World War II, and they came to the United States and tried to assimilate as quickly as possible with not a lot of money, not a lot of resources. But what that ended up resulting in is my family was very committed and dedicated to raising us in a cultural environment, despite the fact that my grandparents came here and tried to make a way in this country in a way that allowed us to stay connected to our culture. And what that looked like in my household was that I grew up Russian Orthodox, which is a very traditional religion. I was expected to occupy certain very gendered roles in my household. We were really involved in the church. My dad was the head warden. My mom was head of the sisterhood. You can start to see the pattern here, right? And I sang in the choir. I was a soprano in the choir, which, it's hard to believe now, but those were some times. But, and the other thing is that, I grew up going to a Russian cultural summer camp where we learned survival skills. And, so I'm your apocalypse pick. If you have a team that you're forming, you want me on it.
It's true.
Yeah. But, it was really challenging for me. And the plenary yesterday, they asked the question of how early on did you have that LGBTQIA influence? And for me, we weren't allowed to watch TV when I was growing up. We didn't have access to the same media that's available now. I didn't have a cell phone till I was 17. There was not a lot of exposure for me up until the point where actually I turned 18 and I got out of my household. I pieced out as soon as I could. mainly because from a really young age, I could just tell that there was something different about me. Like I felt like the black sheep of my family. You know, at a young age, I turned really deeply into drugs and alcohol. You know, I'm in recovery now for 11 years, which is a miracle. And, you know, I spent, when I turned 18, I moved out. I moved from Los Angeles to the Bay Area. And I was exposed to all kinds of different people right through college. My first job while I was still in college was at Apple. I was a genius at the Genius Bar. I had these business cards that said genius on them, and I would like give them to everyone I knew. I was like, see, it says it right here. But it was really through those experiences, right, the exposure through school and my first corporate jobs where there were communities of people who were like me, and I started to feel as if I could exist in those spaces and really find the language that matched how I felt internally. And so it was a big game changer for me. And my progression in understanding my own gender identity, the way that I express myself. Listen, growing up, I was an athlete. I used sports and everything possible to get out of the house, to get out of the way that I was feeling inside, to distract myself. And I was also an amazing athlete, so it ended up working out to my benefit, but I played club travel basketball, where I was, like, for the first time, you know, able to dress the way that I wanted to. I just rocked basketball shorts and jerseys constantly because I felt comfortable in those clothing, you know, and that was a stark difference to how I was raised, where I was literally, my mom made me wear dresses to school growing up, and I hated it. I would pack like pants in my backpack, and then when I got to school, I would change, you know, I would change my clothes. And yeah, so when I started working in the corporate environment and meeting these people, getting out of the nest of my nuclear family was when I really started and was able to unpack more of who I am as a person. And you know, I've only come out as trans non-binary and changed my pronouns within the last 4 years. And it's been a huge shift for me in terms of deepening into the comfort of my own skin. And it's been really transformative for me as a human being, and it's also been really challenging, you know. The world that we live in is conditioned in a number of ways to be binary in thought, in practice, in expression, and you know, there's not a space, unless it's like a purely queer LGBTQIA space, where I'm not going to be misgendered, where I'm not going to be, you know, some sort of box or label isn't going to be placed on me. And so different challenges, I think, just based on cultural upbringing and environment and exposure, but you know, it's been, my journey has really deepened and expanded in the last, you know, 4 to 6 years, because I have had the opportunity to have more exposure, more language, more understanding, you know, because before that, I purely identified as a lesbian. I used she, her pronouns, and it never felt right. Like, it never felt right. I would say that to people, whether it be in a facilitation session or in discussion, and there was always this place in my body. I always relate to somatics because I feel a lot in my body, and there was this place in my body where it just felt sticky. It felt wrong. It felt like weighted. And it wasn't until I started to come out that those places and those feelings started to evaporate from my system. So yeah, that's a little bit about my journey.
I know, so Indy, you and I have worked together now for a little over 2 years. You were my first partner at Uber in crime and working in D&I. And at the time when we met, you were going through the transition, or introducing, I should say, new pronouns to the majority of the company, to your team, to your stakeholders. And then 6-7 months after, you also introduced your new name. Can you talk a little bit about, because I know we had a lot of conversations around what that kind of felt like in a corporate work environment, some of the headwinds that you faced.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you, well, I'm sure many of you don't know this, but I went by another name. I just changed, actually legally and officially, I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary of my legal name change. Which is, oh God, it's such an amazing feeling. It's so freeing. But the introduction of my new pronouns and the introduction of my new name was, I mean, it was challenging in a lot of ways. So when I first decided that I wanted to change my pronouns in the workplace, there are so many systems internally that you have to, like, I don't think people realize how many systems exist internal to a company. And if you're in like HR, you get it, or if you've had to go through this, you get it. But there are so many hoops that have to be jumped through in order to get every single system updated, right? You have your company directory, you have the internal communications channels that you use, you have emails, you have your benefits, you have like literally everything. And I think for me, some of the headwinds that I faced specifically were around normalizing, I always talk about this in practice with DEI, right? Like there's behavioral change and then there's systems change. And in order to uphold and maintain the systems, you have to also manage and develop and nurture those behavioral aspects that support that system, right? So for me, it was around, coming out to all the stakeholders that I support, which happen to be many executives at the company and their leadership teams. And then also going through the process of changing all of the systems, and coming up against the headwinds specific to what happens when somebody gets it wrong. How do you handle that? How do you navigate that as a person? And then, obviously there's a lot of importance in terms of having allyship within the teams because it's exhausting to have to correct people all of the time, right? And there were certain people that got it immediately and it was like no problem. And then there were certain people who didn't. In reality, like, it was never my expectation that everyone would get it right off the bat all the time. And my experience was that was true, right? Like people got it wrong a lot of the time. But that changed, right? Especially as the systems changed. I got to change my internal directory profile information, which allowed me the space to represent myself as who I am. But then there were, and when I changed my name, so the way that I changed my name is I went on sabbatical. And it wasn't planned this way, it just happened this way. But I went on sabbatical because after 5 years, you get a sabbatical at Uber, it's one of our benefits. And boy, did I need the break. I've been with the company since 2016. There's been we've been on a journey. It's been a time, and I needed some time off. And so I went on this sabbatical. And while I was on this sabbatical, I went on a vision quest. These types of experiences are really important to me as a human being. I spend and dedicate and commit a lot of time to self-growth and development. And so I went on a vision quest. And I played with the name and had the participants of the quest use my chosen name, which was like, it felt like I was marinating in a bath of like love and warmth. It was amazing. And I decided that when I'd come back, I'd reintroduce myself to the world as Indigo. It feels good to say that too, And so I reintroduced myself as Indigo to the world and to the workplace. And part of that process is like changing the name and the systems, in Workday, in the directory, in the emails. And changing email aliases, people, is hard, in general. But thankfully, there's a process for that internally. There wasn't a smooth process, as smooth as I think there should have been internally for us. And I feel a lot of gratitude for the privilege that I have to sit in the role that I sit in, because I support policy comms, marketing, finance, and all of our people and places teams globally as their DEI business partner. and I work with their executives and leaders to help develop strategies to advance DEI within their organizations, and then identify the spots where they have opportunities, and we get to work on those opportunities. And so as that DEI business partner, I get to work with benefits. I get to work with the folks who work in HR. I get to work with our folks who work on employee relations. And when I see something that's not working well for me, I'm like, well, listen, this isn't working well for me, and it's not going to work well for the employees who are going to come after me or who are walking right alongside of me, and it's unacceptable. So one of the processes that we started working on was name change with just for email. I had an issue with enrolling in benefits. I remember immediately after the change of my gender identity, and I called up my benefits partner, not on the phone, what am I doing? I called him up, I Slacked messaged her, and I remember saying like, hey, I noticed that in our third-party software that we use to enroll in benefits, that there's only binary genders listed as far as like, how I can enroll. And we had a conversation about it, and it was something that it was an oversight on their part. And with this third-party software that we use. And so they got right to work on it, and I was able to finish the enrollment process. But, it's when changes like this happen, when you have a team that doesn't have the representation from that community to work through some of these issues that folks who don't identify as trans or non-binary, or if they don't know these things and don't know to look for them, they miss them. And then you have people who are attempting to make these transitions into their fullest authentic selves in the workplace, and they run into these challenges. And so it's been, for me, and I know it's been sort of a long-winded answer, but for me it's been a process of coming into acceptance and full love for myself as a human, occupying that space for myself, and then taking on the responsibility because I want to, because of the role that I do, because I love the work that I do, to drive these changes in the ways that I can for the other people that will come after me. So hopefully that answered your question.
It does, and it's not even just the formal processes, right? It's all the things that we didn't think about, because I remember you and I were watching one of our global all hands, which I'm sure other companies have, where they were playing old marketing material or videos that had your dead name still attached to it. And it was something that we didn't even think about that was still existing out there and historical.
Yeah, so there was this external video that was talking about culture at Uber, DEI at Uber, and it was a beautiful video and I loved it, but as the video was splashing across the screen, it said my dead name, and I was horrified. And thankfully, our former CDIO, Bo, she called them right up, and she was like, excuse me.
During the all hands.
During the all hands, literally, the all hands hadn't ended yet, and she was like, I think you forgot something. And thankfully the team was really apologetic about their oversight, but those are the types of things that can happen, and it's damaging, right? Like, and for me, it was damaging in the way that, like, emotionally, it just hit me in such a specific way, and that's not something I want other people to have to feel. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to. So I want to move on as we're talking about kind of working within a corporate environment in a trans or non-binary identity. How is working at Uber kind of impacted overall, you being able to be more authentic or providing more headwinds and challenges? Catherine, I'll start with you. Yes.
Yeah, so before I answer the question about Uber, I'll take a step back and talk about other companies where I worked without naming them. I started my social, medical, legal transition, all of it, all at once, just before I started work in the corporate world. I was in my final year of my master's, and I thought, okay, now is the time before I go into work. Didn't work out that I was comfortable to be myself when I started at work the next year. So I went in the workplace back into the closet initially. Started working at a bank in South Africa, which was, for all intents and purposes, a very progressive employer. They were very inclusive. They had, rainbow branding during Pride Month. I could have potentially felt safe, but at the same time, I was very young, going into a graduate program, and didn't feel that I could challenge people around me that much. That didn't last very well. After 6 months, I thought, no, I can't do this, and came out, and it was, as I said, it was a progressive company, and they did try their very best to be inclusive and welcoming. But I was the first person to come out and transition while working there in the company's 50-year history. And so there was no existing policy in place. There was no playbook. My manager at the time, fortunately, was really supportive and amazing and tried to do her best, but I had to, as a 22-year-old in my first year of work, be the expert. I had to say what the rules should be, how we should go about changing systems, socializing it, communicating it with the team around me, preparing people for that and talking them through it. And I think I look now at people who go through that at Uber, and I think that knowing that there's a playbook and a set of steps, and you don't have to do it yourself and do all of that emotional kind of labor yourself, makes such a huge difference. And then, likewise, at that point, we didn't have inclusive benefits and things, so I got into a lot of credit card debt, paying for my own kind of medical transition.
Sure.
And when I needed to take medical leave, for example, there was a lot of reluctance to give me the amount of time off that I needed, and there wasn't any kind of strategy in place for how to kind of reintroduce into my role when I came back. All the work that I had been doing had been reassigned to somebody else when I came back from leave, and when I came back, there was nothing for me to do, and no one had planned what was going to happen. So I think all of these things, even with best intent, at that time, because I was setting the precedent, I was having to create the playbook, and didn't get it right all the time. But now at Uber, I joined Uber many years after that, and so for the most part, when I come out at Uber, it's a very different experience. It's the repeated coming out that carries on for the rest of your life on your terms when you want it. And everyone has been incredibly welcoming, and I think having a network like Pride at Uber that is so well known within the company and well recognized, and put at the forefront of all hands and things like that on a periodic basis has really helped to give me the opportunity to be myself, talk about my experiences on my own terms. And yeah, I think there've been some benefits and things like that that have become relevant even now, in terms of my partner and I are having a baby next year, and and having kind of access to inclusive family planning benefits to make that possible, and equal parental leave and things like that also make me feel really kind of welcomed and empowered to bring my best self to work.
Thank you. Thank you. Bernardo, same question.
When I joined, I don't know, are you hearing me? Okay, thank you. When I joined Uber, one of the first things that came that I noticed and that was shining in front of me was the fact that our I'm from the legal team, and our legal director back that time was a cisgender lesbian woman, and we don't have the same gender identity, we don't have the same sexual orientation, but I didn't thought that I was getting in touch with a person from our community in a leadership position, because first of all, in tech companies, reality was so far from my experience in my life that I didn't think about this kind of things in the past. But when I knew that person, that she was the manager of my manager back that time, and she was one of the person that was leading the ERG, the Pride at Uber, in Brazil. It was in 2017, I'm sorry. And seeing a person that was in the leadership, that was advocating for the community, that was working for a more inclusive workplace, not only in her team, but in the entire company, it was really a thing that that caught me, because I was thinking that, okay, back that time, I didn't realize yet that I was a transgender person, but I knew that something was going to be really good about working with that team, in that place, in that company. And as I already mentioned, I started to work volunteering in the ERG, and the team was trying to understand with the current transgender employees how their process happened. How was their hiring process, their integration with the team, things that went well, things that didn't, how the company could improve everything. So it was the first time that I met this specific group of people that volunteered to be part of this conversation. And during the conversation, I was very emotional. And in the end, I raised my hand and I said out loud for the first time that I am a transgender person. I was really hugged. I cried a lot. It was really a special moment. It was not meant to be about me, but it was so important for me to understand that I was part of that group of people, that I had the opportunity to have this sense of belonging and community. And I couldn't help but started to volunteer more and more and more to work in the ERG's project, the Pride at Uber projects. And when I finally came out to my team and to all the teams and external partners that we have, we had back that time the Transgender Task Force. That was a group of people that built our gender transition guidelines. And I was the second global lead for the Transgender Task Force. And it was so good because after they launched the gender transition guidelines, we were trying to really build an internal community to understand, okay, we know we have transgender employees, we have the community here, but I was from Brazil. I don't knew people from US. I don't knew people from EMEA, from APAC. And trying to build this internal community, I started to get to know those people and understand not only more about our own community, but about myself too, and the common things that we have and the different ones. So one practical thing that we did was create an internal channel only for the transgender non-binary community for us to chat and to get to know each other. And it was so amazing because through that Slack channel in, I don't know, years ago, I met Ayan, our colleague from APAC. And it was before the beginning of his gender transition too. And we chat a lot, exchange information. It was, in fact, the first time that I met virtually someone from India. And this type of relationships that we started to build really, they were really important also for us to understand the differences that we had across the organization, across regions, and to discuss things, to understand what is happening, and it's very good in that region, what is not happening. And for instance, the gender transition guidelines that I mentioned, we understood that we had to translate it to Portuguese, because one of the first things that that we have to consider when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion is that it's important for people to understand, and language is like a primary thing to really understand what is being said to us and the rights that we have. So we did that work, and we translated it to Portuguese, then to Spanish, and we also localized it to the reality that we have in Latin America and Brazil. So have this type of opportunity in a company that I can raise my hand and say, I think that it's important, I think that it will impact my community, and people say, okay, so let's do it. It's something that really blows my mind, this kind of opportunity that we have. And one other thing that I realized working these years at Uber is that people really value that you are part of an ERG. I'm formerly a part of Pride at Uber, but I'm also an Able at Uber member, that is ERG. I'm a person without disability, but I'm an ally of this ERG. And being our managers, our teams, knowing that it's important, not only for the company, but for us, for our internal and external community, that we are part of this kind of groups, is so important, and it's really drive change. So yeah, I could mention a lot of the great things that I learned across this journey, but I think that will the highlights.
I don't want to minimize something that you said there too, Bernardo. So Bernardo and I were able to meet for the first time in person last year at Out and Equal. And the contingent from Latin America this year has grown to 10 to 12 individuals participating. But I remember you pulling me and a few others aside last year and sharing the story with me that you had brought and purchased your very first suit, and how important that was to you, and culturally even how big of a moment that is. And then being able to do it at a place in front of identities and community that you don't normally have, how important that was. And I don't want to minimize that point of moments like these matter, particularly for our international community. Yes, it's a lot cheaper for a company to send our US and Canadian folks, but the exposure, the community building, the not being an only in a country. Catherine, you represent a country where we have one, right? In an office that is being active and participating with a larger global community. You wouldn't get that opportunity otherwise.
Absolutely.
So I want to continue to kind of, in the time that we have left, really looking at things from kind of an international and a regional lens and some of the complexities and nuances that we have in this space. So whether it is working with the business as a business partner, whether it is working across our Pride, ERG, BRG, within region, what are some of the nuances and complexities that tie both the work that we're trying to do and your identities that we don't necessarily think about? So Catherine, I'll start with you.
Great. So I think there are obviously a lot of great things that can be done top-down globally in terms of making sure that policies, benefits, procedures, systems are inclusive, but that only goes so far. And there's a lot of things that unfortunately need to be done on a country-by-country or even state-by-state basis because of the context from a legal perspective, from a third-party vendor perspective that it exists in each of those contexts, and from a cultural and social acceptance, knowledge, language perspective. I think some of the things in particular that we've had to do locally and that we're in the process of doing locally is around benefits, around health insurance benefits in particular, where in the US and Canada we have very inclusive benefits that cover a very wide range of things that a trans person might need. Where we, in other countries, have smaller offices, as you mentioned, in South Africa, there are about 100 people, and I'm the only out LGBTQ plus person that I'm aware of in that office. We don't have the same kind of footprint and the same kind of influence in our engagement with third-party vendors that provide our health insurance benefits, that provide our insurance, broader insurance kind of benefits, which have to be done locally and plugged into local service providers, etc. And so those kind of things require a lot of effort. It requires actually taking the time to find out what are the alternatives, where do we currently stand. We have a footprint of, keep me honest, on how many countries, I think 90 plus countries where we have offices. Going through one by one and finding out where we stand is an exercise that we're busy with. We've made progress on, and we've had some great changes in the past couple of years. I think particularly of India, where Ayan really spearheaded the drive to improve our offering there for employees, and it's been wonderful to see, but it's an ongoing thing. And it's unfortunately still often has to be driven by an individual there who needs that benefit, because the reality is we have only so many hands and we have to prioritize, and that's a challenge, but it's something I think we're getting better at.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point when you're working across 90 plus countries, whether you're thinking about policies or benefits, but particularly even for our community. One of the very first exercises that you have to do, even looking at things as small as like self-identification and requesting ID and identity, you have to look at things from a legislative level by country basis first. And that's constantly a moving and evolving target and map. You have to look at scale across that country. You have to look at cost across that country. You have to at least meet country standards in some place. And meeting that as the bare minimum before we can even offer above. So Bernardo, I know you're familiar with a lot of the complexities from a legal kind of standpoint as you kind of work around. But talk a little bit about kind of some of the challenges that you've had as a regional leader, as you work internationally and in this space.
Yeah, one of the things that we already mentioned here is regarding language. I would say that, first of all, it's really important to understand the differences between concepts across regions. Because, for example, identities are really different. I could list a lot of different identities that are not common discussed. But, for example, in Latin America, and I can speak for Brazil, we have a specific gender identity that is travestis. Travestis, how can I say, a feminine gender identity that is claimed by trans women, but it's in a political way. But when we just translate it to English, it could be something like transvestite, which is not the same thing. It's really not the same thing. Have a different, it's a different context, and for Brazilian transgender women, it's really important for them to raise their hand and say, I am a travesti. For us, it's really different. It's really political. But when we are discussing this kind of things in a global scale, in a large company, that things maybe when we're trying to build policies and, I don't know, create playbooks and guidelines, this type of things can be seen as a secondary thing. But so for that not to happen, it's really important to not only, of course, have internal representation in the local and regional office, but people reach out to this person to understand what are their perspectives for them, if they are up to reveal something, to approve from the regional and local perspectives, because this type of things, and not only different concepts and names for gender identities with regional nuances, but also how we communicate things are really important. One thing that I could also mention is that in English is not my first language is Portuguese, and in English we don't have a lot of gendered words. In Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, in Italian, we do have that. And it's a challenge when we are trying to build inclusive and gender-neutral language. So these kind of things, they are crucial to a large and a global company consider when we are trying to really reach diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. So this is some examples that I could mention that we faced along this journey, and we are also with a lot of help trying to tackle and to change and build this awareness across all the regions.
I want to double click a little bit on intersectionality here for a moment, since you kind of started that topic a little bit, Bernardo. You came up to me prior to the panel, and we were talking about even the regional and country by country definition of what race identity looks like. And Indy, I know in the D&I realm, Uber right now, we have been trying to drive a study around what underrepresented populations look like, country by country. and really getting into the work, because it is not the same definitions that we use. And in fact, Bernardo, you were speaking with somebody who had asked you a question that you didn't feel comfortable representing someone because in Brazil, you are perceived as white. And coming over to the US and Canada, you are perceived as brown. And so in Brazil, you've had the privileges of somebody that would be identified as white in that country. But you would then lose your privileges in just crossing a border. So Indy, I want to swing over to you. We often, from whether it's business or D&I, we're always think globally, act locally, which is a lot harder said than done. But would love your lens overall on this topic.
Yeah, thanks. Listen, like a global solution cannot be applied consistently throughout. It's just not possible. In theory, it sounds great, right? Like we want to apply this solution and it's going to work everywhere, but it doesn't work that way. When I think about how to translate global solutions or just inclusive solutions on a global basis, what it really boils down to is spending time nurturing and developing local familiarity, local nuance. And for me, in my role, what that's required is spending a lot of time nurturing and developing relationships across the multiple lines of business, and really within some of the more nuanced local contexts. You have a team of folks like benefits, right, who focus on global benefits and then regional-based benefits, but even, and it was mentioned before, like regionally, you have variances country by country, state by state, and so you have to look at some of those nuances. And for me, like what I really love to do is to really get into the weeds of like those nuances, but also like we're not the only experts. Like in fact, we are not experts at everything. I'm not an expert at anything really. I'm always learning, and I really encourage my partners to do the same, right? Like any organization, no matter where you're at, and I've worked for Apple, Airbnb, and now Uber. And you have to rely on not only the experts within those local spaces, the people who this is impacting, the people who have been in and doing their roles as benefits or compensation experts for however long they've been doing it, but you also have to rely on the industry, right? Like there's a lot of local industry experts that can be super helpful and beneficial to helping us like advance like what we're doing, but also what we're not seeing yet. And I think those, non-corporate partners are really critical and important. You have local equality offices that are helpful. You have nonprofit organization, NGOs, like those partnerships and relationship developments are super critical. And in places where, and I'll just give this example, in a place where I was recently having a conversation with our benefits team and all of the regional leads, and there was some banter around like how we can be continuously expansive on specifically our trans benefits, and someone made mention of some sort of local law, and I was like, okay, yes, that's the law, but how can we show up and extend benefits to our employees where the law doesn't cover or even address or even acknowledge who they are as a human being, right? Because like there are so many countries in the world that have laws that inhibit people from occupying their authentic selves in a public societal space. And so, it's about, it really takes a village for me. It takes a village. It's partnering and understanding local regional nuances, and that takes time. When I came in, really, I had vinegar running through my veins. I was like all gung-ho, as someone who feels really passionate about this work. And that's really good, and I'm grateful to maintain that sort of zest and that passion. And it takes way longer than I want it to most of the time. And so there's a certain level of commitment and partnership and nurturing those relationships, and having the hard conversations and having the nuanced conversations, and bringing multiple voices into the room and partnering externally, right? Like, and that stuff takes time, but that is what sustainable growth looks like. You want to make a quick change, go for it. It's not going to sustain over time. If you want sustainable change that lasts, you have to go and invest that extra time. That's my perspective, yeah.
I want to make sure that we include in the narrative before we open up to some Q&As. I just am seeing the time now. Some narrative from our Asia Pacific region. If I could have a mic brought down to the gentleman in the first row. Wave your hand, Brian. So, Brian, before you begin, I wanted to share with the larger audience, your words from last year never left me in regards to kind of an international perspective of when we talk about community, we are only as strong as the least progressed. And a lot of time we put our strength and energy into where we have the majorative, the dominant. And I remember you correctly calling out other ERG leaders in last year's workspace and saying, hey, you're having this conversation over here, but we're still having the conversation that you had 10 years ago. Don't forget that. And so would love for you to kind of share some of your thoughts, some of the things that I know Ion has been close to, so that you can kind of represent some of that narrative.
Definitely. Brian, he, him pronouns. Formerly in the APAC region, so I could definitely intelligently talk about the experiences that we had. But to your point, it was mentioned many times already. A lot of the conversations that I've attended, even in other Out and Equal forums, in the conversations that we're having right now, are not the same problems that we are facing still in the Asia-Pacific region at this point in time. I would say that looking at benefits, looking at language, looking at the laws that we have, you look at least the 11 countries that we operate in APAC. Each of those countries have different journeys. We must, number one, look at where we can standardize when we can, but definitely individualize per country when you have to. For instance, in India, I must say that Ayan's not here. I'm not gonna share his journey with everybody, but at least talk about what I know. For a very long time, when Ayan was still thinking about the transition that he was going to have, he can't even share it. Because in a country wherein deep societal prejudice and discrimination exist, even if, let's say, you feel safety and authenticity within yourself to share it with your organization, you know that you're going to lose something. But did we have a playbook? Did we have a transition support group? That is very different from what we have in the US. In the US, you look at where you're at and you see somebody else that you can definitely resonate with. There's a playbook that you can look into. Is there a standardized and targeted playbook for India? These are the nuances that I believe still exist that we have to look into. Just because looking at it, the journey, like our North Star, should be towards the same direction, but the respect as to where the current part or the current journey is must be upheld. So.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you for letting me pick on you and put you on the spot. So one quick round robin question before we open it up to the audience for some Q&A. If you could give one more piece of advice from a international lens, from a trans non-binary lens, what is an important takeaway that you would like the audience to take away from this conversation? Indy, I'll start with you and put you on the spot first.
Love that. You know how I love being put on the spot. Yeah, for me, and I think this is like pretty clear just thematically in what I've shared about is like, I can't do it alone, you know, and I have all of the cross-functional stakeholders that I work with to thank for like theoretically creating a chain of humans to get things done. And so my advice is like, work with other people and continue knocking on the doors until the doors that open to you are available and allow you to make the changes that you need to make. For me, like, I keep knocking on doors, and if the doors don't open, I see what's up with the window, and if I can open the window, right? And so, you know, product equity, benefits, you know, leaders that you have access to, mentors that you might have, ERGs, like marketing, go through every channel possible until you find partners who can and will stand next to you on the journey and help you find out the information you seek and push for the changes that you hope to push. That's, I can't do any of my work alone, and I am not successful in my role if it weren't for all of the people that I work alongside. So that's my advice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine.
I think I first want to just pick up on something that Brian mentioned, and something I think we need to reiterate is the different levels of safety in terms of being able to bring your authentic self through the doors of the office. It's great to have an inclusive employer inside the building, but as you move through the world in and out of that building, it's not always going to be safe to be your full, authentic, beautiful self in every context. And that's a sad reality, but it is a reality, and I think we've seen it in a lot of markets. There's in Asia Pacific, but also in EMEA, a lot of Africa and the Middle East especially. Any form of marginalized sexual or gender identity is completely criminalized. And so we've had to be creative about how we hold space for the queer and trans community in those places, and not necessarily label those events as queer events or put rainbows outside. We have to be creative about how we provide support and community in those spaces. And I think my advice is then, to echo something that was said in one of the earlier plenaries, to really focus on agency over authenticity. And for yourself as a queer or trans person, or for somebody that's trying to support a queer or trans person, to really know that you don't owe it to anyone to be out and proud all the time, everywhere, in every context, and that you can do it at your own pace, as in when you feel safe, comfortable, and just feel like it.
Thank you, Catherine, for that answer. Bernardo.
I would say that companies are part of the private sector, and the private sector also has a social duty. So not only to build and rebuild inclusive services and products, but also to influence in the societies we serve. So the companies are only going to achieve that moment when they have internal representation. And to have internal representation, it doesn't mean only to open roles and positions for that communities, but also to prepare the workplace to receive them and to retain them. So that would be my real advice.
Thank you. All right, I think we've got a few minutes left. We'd like to open up the floor to any questions for the panelists.
Thank you. I'm Dan. I'm a cisgender man. My pronouns are he, him. So I work at Uber in both the Pride ERG, but also in the marketing team in the Sydney office. I think one of the challenges that I found is that I really want trans and non-binary kind of inputs and perspectives in both sides of my work, my kind of gay job and day job. But I don't know any out trans or non-binary colleagues in our office or in the region, or in the Australia country. So how would you kind of suggest that we kind of go about ensuring that we have those inputs, both across our kind of marketing work and our ERG work?
Can you repeat the last part of your question? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Just how would you suggest we go about trying to get some of those inputs if we don't know any kind of out trans or non-binary colleagues?
Yeah, so if I understand your question properly, it's like there's not a lot of representation in your office, and you're looking for more inputs from a marketing / business perspective.
Both marketing and on the ERG side.
Yeah, I think, and you can chime in too here. I think this is the place where it's really helpful and critical to partner with the ERG, but also like representatives locally who are helping to advocate for the expansion of these channels. And I'll be really frank and say that they don't exist as robustly in all places, right? Like the ears the channels to certain folks in places like San Francisco, those roads are very wide, right? Like we know that, but in places where they are a little bit more narrow, those roads, I would say partner with your local DEI business partner or someone from the DEI team who is based in your region, who can help kind of massage and develop those clear channels. I think it's really about networking too, right? Like every advancement or every expansion is about building and developing those relationships. So I would work with your DEI person locally to understand like what those dynamics might look like and how you can continue to nurture those.
I would say a +1 to everything that Indy just said. The only other thing that I would add to that, so a yes and, is, and I'm looking around the podium here at you, Dan. I think the most important thing for us, particularly in regions or offices where everyone else may not feel safe, because we're not going to be able to provide the data. We're not going to, we want to protect the safety of the individuals that don't want to be known, is the more that if you feel safe, the more vocal you are, the more that you show up in your visibility, the more that people will come to you. And I promise they will come to you. That is the one thing that I have learned as I have moved throughout my D&I journey, is the more that I have owned my own voice, being a senior leader in an organization, being out, that the community will find you. And so if you're not getting it through the other channels because people aren't locally identified in a system, make sure that you know you're the person that they can come to talk to.
That's great advice.
I'd like to
Another
add
question.
one other thing to what you've both beautifully said. Is also to plug into networks outside of the organization. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations and NGOs working in many, many cities around the world. And there are a lot of people out and equal from all over the world to network with and get input from as well.
Hi, everyone. It's Joyce Kamoon, she, her. First of all, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I know we're short on time, so just to hone in on a little bit of what you said, or just go straight to the point and build towards the end. Sometimes there are difficulties building the case, and I appreciate you saying knock on all the doors, and kind of like, you were talking a little bit about, I mean, you guys said a lot, but anyway, if you're going beyond borders and there's that discrepancy with the benefits and so forth, take like marital licensing, just that, right? So how do you have that conversation without burning any relationships while keeping everyone in the room, or if not for today, for the longer conversation? So you recognize it in one place, but you can't recognize it in another place. And you mentioned a bit third parties and like some of that, but how much wiggle room? I'm talking industry practice right now. And then, you know, we're short on a lot of our ends, right? But I don't know, I'm curious, does Uber recognize? I mean, is it across the board or not?
I'll take that question. So I believe in very transparency and safety is in how I answer. So I love your directness, and I'm going to be direct back. Also, I need to stretch and move. So I'm only getting up for that reason and that reason alone. The reality of it is I don't think there is a best practice in how we roll this out yet for any large global organization. When I go into any room to discuss, and you actually brought one up that is great because we are actually in the middle of having that conversation, there are several layers to this. The reason we usually take it country by country at a very honest level is because of scale and because of cost. I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent. Those are the right answers, but that is usually what a company is looking at from behind the lines and behind the lens. The very first practice that we go through is going through usually also not just our internal but external from a legislative lens so that we have all of that there. So again, we're meaning bare minimum and we see where all of our risks are going to be in that space. Then we look to the advantage of, okay, what will it cost? What's going to be the analysis for us to do it at one level across the board? Right now, Bernardo actually brought to the group in Brazil, for an example, our maternity and paternity leave are not equitable. And you'll see that in a lot of different countries. And particularly for our trans community and our non-binary community, it is the question of, well, which category do I get in from the country? Particularly since they are going off my birth certificate or my ID versus my own transition. So do I get Uber's recognizing me as he, him, or she, her, but the actual legislation is not. So the conversation we're having now is to do exactly that and make it a bar minimum. So looking across all our best practices and saying, all right, we're going to take the lower aggregator, which is the paternity, move it up to the higher aggregator, which is the maternity, and making sure that meets all country standards. So that is how we would do with any benefit or policy. The other thing that companies, though, look at is, you know, overall, what is your population there? What is the business use there? And quite honestly, really the answer is, particularly when you're taking a look at benefits, this is not as expensive as you think. And this is where business resource groups can drive real change. Travis, our global head of ERGs, is in the audience, and he has been driving a ERG to BRG challenge with our executives. And part of the conversations they're having in the rooms with the executives right now are actually, you know what? We know this is not our expertise, but what we can do with our ERG budget is we can do the stuff that you don't have time to do, meaning the cost analysis. We'll go and hire somebody else, we'll take a look, they'll do the cost analysis, we'll come back with all of the answers and just saying, instead of saying this is what we want. And that's been really working for us as we start to roll this out. You're welcome.
To wrap up.
I know we're at time. I want to give one more big round of applause to these people up on stage.